My name is Elena Hargrove, or at least, that's who I used to be. For 31 years, I carried that name like it was armor. Now I carry it like a scar I finally learned to wear with pride. Hey everyone, welcome back to the quiet stories we don't usually tell out loud. If you're here for the first time, pull up a chair, grab your coffee, and settle in. This isn't the loud, screaming kind of drama you see everywhere else. This is the deep, slow-burning kind that changes how you see your own family. The kind that stays with you long after the video ends. Have you ever stood in a room full of 500 people, watching your father's entire empire freeze in real time because of choices he made with his own mouth 6 months earlier? Yeah. That was my night. It happened at the grand opening of my father's $1.2 billion flagship resort, the crown jewel he'd spent years bragging about. The lights were perfect, the ocean glittered under the overwater pavilion, and the air smelled like expensive champagne and quiet desperation. I wasn't there as the disowned daughter sneaking in the back. I was there as the structural engineer whose stamp was required for the most photographed room in the entire building to legally open. But that's not even the part that broke him. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, voice booming with excitement. Tonight, for the very first time, we are honored to welcome the chairman of North Star Aviation Group in person. My father turned toward the stage with that hungry, triumphant smile he always wore when a deal was about to close. The same smile he used when he told me I had to marry the man he chose. The smile that said he still believed he controlled everything. Then my husband squeezed my hand once, gave me the smallest, calmest smile, and walked up onto that stage. The massive screen behind the podium lit up with clean white letters. North Star Aviation Group, founder and chairman, Marcus Hale. I watched my father's face drain of color like someone had pulled a plug. His champagne flute slipped from his fingers and shattered across the marble floor. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My sister Liv lowered her phone for the first time in years and just stared, speechless. 500 people rose to their feet in a wave of applause for the man my father had publicly called a worthless grease monkey who fixes other people's machines, at our wedding just 6 months earlier. If you've ever been told you were nothing by the people who were supposed to love you most, type, I see you, in the comments right now. I read every single one, and I promise you're not alone in this. Because this story isn't really about revenge. It's about what happens when you stop auditioning for a love that was never unconditional. It's about the quiet power you discover when you finally measure your worth by what you build with your own 2 hands instead of what someone else is willing to hand you. My father thought cutting me off would break me. Instead, it taught me who I really was. Let me take you back to the beginning, but I'll only stay there long enough to show you how we got here. My father, Richard Hargrove, didn't just build resorts. He built an image. An empire where everything and everyone had to look perfect from a distance. I grew up in that world, surrounded by marble floors, ocean views, and the constant pressure to be the daughter who made the family look good. But behind the luxury, there was always this quiet tension. My father measured people by what they could add to the Hargrove name. My mother played the perfect hostess, smiling through every dinner while reminding me that appearances are everything. My younger sister Liv learned early how to work the cameras and the crowd. And then there was me, the one who always had dirt on her hands and questions in her head. The only person who ever made me feel truly seen was my grandfather, Papa James. He was the one who started it all, turning a single rundown beach motel into the foundation my father later built his empire on. But unlike my dad, Papa never forgot where he came from. I remember one afternoon when I was 12. We were standing inside one of the old motels my father was about to modernize. Papa handed me his old brass level, heavy, worn smooth by decades of real work. I held it against a crooked beam, and he taught me the most important lesson of my life. Never trust a wall because it looks pretty, Ellie, he said quietly. Trust what you can measure. Real strength isn't loud, it's steady. That moment stayed with me more than any boardroom speech or charity gala my father ever dragged me to. Papa James let me spend hours in his old workshop behind the first motel. I learned how to read blueprints, how to calculate simple loads, and how to respect the integrity of a structure. My hands got calloused, my mind got sharper. And for the first time, I felt like I was building something real. My father hated it. He called it a cute little hobby for a Hargrove daughter. Engineering wasn't for girls who were supposed to marry well and represent the family. While Liv got a black Amex card at 16 and a debutante ball that made the society pages, I was sneaking into night classes and working weekend internships just to pay for my structural engineering degree. I remember the night I told my father I'd been accepted into the program. He barely looked up from his laptop. "You don't need that, Elena. We have people for those things. Focus on what actually matters." So I did it anyway, on my own. Late nights studying after hosting events I didn't care about. Coffee that tasted like exhaustion. Rejections from so-called friends who said I was making things awkward for the family. But every time it got hard, I'd pull out Papa's brass level from my bag and run my thumb along the worn edge. It reminded me that some things in life you have to measure for yourself. If you've ever felt like the odd one out in your own family, the one who didn't fit the mold they tried to force on you, drop a different in the comments. I see you. I was that girl for a long time. Looking back now, I realize my father wasn't cruel in the cartoonish way people expect. He was controlling because he was terrified of losing the image he'd spent his life perfecting. He believed the only way to protect the family was to control every piece of it, including me. What he never understood was that by trying to shape me into his version of success, he was pushing me toward the very independence that would eventually challenge him. Those years taught me something deep. Inheritance might open doors, but it can't teach you how to stand on your own when those doors slam shut. I just didn't know how soon I would need that lesson. That independence I was quietly building eventually led me to the place where my real life began, a small regional airfield tucked away from the glossy resorts my father owned. My firm had been hired to assess the structural integrity of an aging hangar before a potential expansion. I spent the entire morning crawling through steel trusses with a flashlight and notebook, measuring corrosion on gusset plates and calculating load paths. It was the kind of work that made me feel completely alive. That's when I noticed him. A man in faded coveralls wiping his hands on a rag near the hangar doors. His name tag read Marcus Hale. He watched me for a moment, then walked over and said something that changed everything. "That plate's been lying to inspectors for years. Tell me what you actually see." Most men in his position would have nodded politely or tried to impress me with small talk. Marcus didn't. He listened. Then he gently challenged two of my initial assessments. He was right on both, and when I pointed out where he was slightly off on a third, he admitted it immediately with a small, genuine smile. We ended up talking for over 2 hours that day. Not about my last name or my father's empire. We talked about stress tolerances in materials under wind load, about why some structures fail not because they're weak, but because someone cut corners for appearance. He asked me what I would design if no one was watching and no one was paying me. No one in my family had ever asked me that question. After work, he bought me coffee from a little diner with cracked vinyl booths instead of the upscale cafe down the road. He paid in cash from a worn leather wallet. I noticed how the pilots on the tarmac gave him respectful nods, a little deeper than you'd expect for a regular maintenance engineer, but I didn't press. There was something grounding about being seen for my mind instead of my family name. Over the next few months, our connection grew in the quietest, most honest way possible. Early morning walks along the runway fence. Late-night texts about engineering problems we were both working on. He never tried to impress me with money or status. Instead, he showed up consistently, with tools, with patience, and with a kind of steady strength I had never known from the men in my world. One evening in that same hangar, as the sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks, Marcus got down on one knee. No grand production, no audience. Just him, me, and the faint smell of jet fuel and metal. He pulled out a simple titanium ring he had machined himself on the lathe in the back. The seam was slightly imperfect, perfectly human. His hands were steady, but I could see the nervousness in his eyes. "Elena, I can't give you the life you grew up with," he said softly. "I can't offer private jets or trust funds. But I promise I will never ask you to shrink yourself to make me feel bigger. I want to build a life with you, where we both get to stand tall." Tears filled my eyes as I said yes before he could even finish. It wasn't just a proposal. It was the first time someone loved me for who I actually was, not who I was supposed to become. Of course, telling my family was like lighting a fuse on something far bigger than I understood at the time. If you've ever fallen in love with someone your family didn't approve of, someone they thought was beneath you, type real love in the comments. That fear of disappointing the people who raised you is heavy, isn't it? I gave my father 2 months' notice, the same way you warn someone before a controlled demolition. I hoped, somewhere deep down, he might surprise me. But hope can be a dangerous thing when it's placed in the wrong hands. Telling my father about Marcus felt like stepping off a ledge I had been staring at for months. We were sitting at the long dining table overlooking the water at one of his flairs, the kind of table where deals were made and futures decided. My father was cutting into a perfectly cooked steak when I said it. "I'm seeing someone seriously, Dad. His name is Marcus Hale. We're planning to get married." The knife stopped midair. He set it down slowly, the way he did when he was calculating the best way to dismantle an opponent. My mother's smile froze. Liv looked up from her phone with wide eyes, already smelling content for her followers. "Marcus Hale," my father repeated, as if tasting something unpleasant. "And what exactly does this Marcus do?" "He's an aircraft maintenance engineer, a damn good one." The silence that followed was heavier than any yelling could ever be. My father leaned back in his chair, studying me like I was a bad investment. "In this family, marriage isn't about feelings. Elena, it's about strategy. Legacy. I've already spoken with the Whitmore family. Their son Preston would be an excellent match. The merger alone would strengthen our coastal holdings significantly." I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm not a business asset, Dad. I'm your daughter. I'm choosing Marcus." He smiled then, that cold, calculated smile I had seen him use in boardrooms. "You want a wedding? Fine. I'll give you one you'll never forget. But understand this. Hargroves don't marry mechanics. If you go through with this, there will be consequences." Those words hung in the air like a threat wrapped in silk. I should have been more afraid, but something in me had already started shifting. Papa James's brass level was in my bag that night. I ran my thumb over it under the table and felt a quiet strength settle in my bones. The next 2 months were a strange kind of quiet war. My father upgraded our simple chapel wedding into a spectacle. He invited over 300 of his business associates, investors, and society friends. He had seating charts printed on thick cream cardstock. Marcus was placed near the emergency exit with a small placard that simply read, "Guest." My mother tried her version of intervention. She showed up at my apartment with bridal magazines and carefully arranged sorrow on her face. "Darling, do you understand what this does to your father? To all of us? You're throwing away everything we've built for a man who smells like motor oil." I looked at her and said something I had never said before. "Motor oil smells honest, Mom. I've grown to love it." She left without another word. Liv, of course, turned it into content. She posted cryptic stories with laughing emojis and wrenches. Preston Whitmore went around telling people he had dodged a bullet. Through all of it, Marcus remained my calm anchor. He never pushed, never got angry. When I told him about my father's threat, he simply nodded and said, "Let him do what he needs to do. At the end of the day, we'll still be married. That's what matters." His steadiness gave me courage. While my family was busy performing disappointment, I was quietly preparing. I updated my consulting contracts, strengthened my small engineering firm, and made sure I had enough saved to stand on my own if everything fell apart. If you've ever felt your family slowly tightening the ropes around your choices, trying to pull you back into their version of success, type boundaries in the comments. Setting them is hard but necessary. The night before the wedding, I sat on the porch of our small rental house near the airfield, holding Papa James's brass level in my hands. I whispered to myself the same thing he used to tell me. Measure twice, cut once, and never be afraid to stand alone if the structure isn't sound. I didn't know it then, but I was preparing for a demolition far bigger than my father could imagine. The morning of the wedding, the sky was impossibly clear, like even the weather was trying to perform for my father. I stood in front of the mirror in a simple, elegant dress I had chosen myself. No designer label, no drama. Just something that felt like me. Marcus had already left for the chapel, calm as ever. I slipped Papa James's brass level into my small clutch like a talisman and whispered, "Let's do this." When we arrived, I immediately knew my father had turned our intimate ceremony into his own production. The parking lot was filled with luxury cars, 300 guests, most of whom I barely knew. And right at the entrance, on a gilded easel, was the seating chart he had personally designed. Marcus's name was listed near the emergency exit. Underneath it, in elegant script, was a single word, guest. My stomach twisted, but I lifted my chin and walked down the aisle anyway. Marcus waited for me at the front, looking steady in his simple suit. When our eyes met, the noise of the room faded. For those few minutes, it was just us. The ceremony itself was beautiful and real. Our vows were short, honest, and full of the quiet promises we had made to each other. But the moment the officiant pronounced us married, I felt the shift. My father was already rising from his seat at the head table, champagne glass in hand. A toast. The room fell obediently silent. He smiled that polished, boardroom smile and began speaking in the calm, measured tone that made people sign contracts without reading the fine print. "I built this empire from nothing so that my children would never have to settle," he said, pacing slowly. I had hoped Elena would carry the Hargrove name forward with someone worthy of it, someone who understands legacy. He stopped beside Marcus, looking down at him with thinly veiled contempt. Instead, she chose a mechanic, a man who fixes other people's machines for a living. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. Phones started rising like periscopes. As of today, my father continued, voice steady and cold. Elena is no longer a Hargrove in any way that matters. No inheritance, no trust fund, no connection to this family's empire. She has chosen her path. I hope she enjoys the life of a mechanic's wife. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother dabbed at dry eyes on schedule. Liv had her phone up, filming every second. I felt the weight of 300 stairs waiting for me to break. But I didn't. Marcus stood up slowly. No rush, no anger. He buttoned his jacket and faced my father across the room with that same calm certainty I had fallen in love with. "Thank you for the toast, Mr. Hargrove," he said, his voice carrying clearly without effort. "And thank you for the clarity. We don't need it." 4 simple words, spoken without heat. They landed harder than any shout ever could. Then I stood. My hands were steady as I faced the room my father had filled against me. "I spent 31 years trying to earn a love that came with conditions," I said quietly. "Today, I stopped auditioning. I didn't lose a family. I simply stopped trying to fit into one that never really saw me. If you came here expecting a tragedy, I'm sorry to disappoint you. This is still a wedding. Stay and celebrate with us or leave. The choice is yours." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Then, somewhere in the middle of the room, one person started clapping. Then another. And another, more than I expected, including some of my father's own guests. My father's jaw tightened. He gathered my mother and Liv and walked out without another word. About 80 people followed them. The rest stayed. Later that evening, after the unwanted guests had left, we danced on the cleared floor to soft music. Marcus held me close and whispered, "Any regrets?" "Not a single one," I told him. But even in that moment of peace, I knew the real storm was only beginning. If you've ever had your worth publicly torn down by someone who was supposed to protect you, type healing in the comments. I see you. That night I went to bed as a married woman who had just been erased from her own family. What came next tested everything I thought I knew about strength. The morning after the wedding, reality hit like a cold wave. I woke up in our small clapboard house near the airfield, the one we had quietly moved into weeks earlier. Sunlight streamed through the simple curtains, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. Then my phone started buzzing. Canceled credit cards, frozen accounts, a short, clinical email from the family foundation, terminating my advisory role effective immediately. My father hadn't just made a dramatic toast. He had followed through with surgical precision. Within 48 hours, every financial thread connecting me to the Hargrove name was severed. Old friends sent polite texts saying they were so sorry, but Daddy did business with my father. Society invitations stopped arriving. Even people I had known since childhood suddenly had very busy schedules. It hurt more than I expected. Not the money itself, but the quiet confirmation that so many relationships had been built on proximity to power rather than genuine connection. But here's what my father never understood. He could cancel the cards, but he couldn't cancel the skills I had spent years developing in the shadows. I sat at our tiny kitchen table that first week, opened my laptop, and did what I had been trained to do. I calculated the load, rent, groceries, utilities, my small savings. The independent consulting contracts I had been nurturing for the past 2 years. The math was tight, but it held, barely. Marcus offered to cover everything, gently, without pressure. I need to stand on my own first, I told him one night, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. Then we can stand together. He didn't argue. He simply put his hand on my shoulder and let me work. Those first few months were a masterclass in quiet resilience. I took on every legitimate project that came my way. A failing marina dock that needed urgent assessment. A historic community theater requiring structural reinforcement. A small college gymnasium that couldn't afford expensive mistakes. Each job was modest compared to my father's empire, but every stamp I put on those drawings carried my name. Not Hargrove, just Elena Hale. Word of mouth began to spread in the local engineering circles. Clients who valued precision over prestige started referring me to others. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. And for the first time in my life, it felt completely mine. Then, 3 weeks after the wedding, I received a call from a lawyer I had never met. Ruth Ellison had handled my grandfather, Papa James's affairs for decades. "Your grandfather left specific instructions," she said softly when I met her in her quiet office that smelled of old books and lemon polish. "Certain things were to pass to you only if you married someone of your own choosing, without your father's approval." She slid a simple envelope across the desk. Inside was Papa James's old brass level, the original one I had held as a child, and a letter written in his careful draftsman's handwriting. He had dated it 14 months before he passed. My mother had been asked to deliver it on my wedding day. She had chosen not to. I read the letter with tears streaming down my face. Papa James wrote about how proud he was of the woman I was becoming. He left me his old workshop behind the first motel, the cinder block building filled with tools that still carried his scent. And he had quietly funded several of my early patents from my student days, including one structural damping bracket I had designed in college and almost forgotten. Those patents had been earning modest royalties for years, completely outside my father's control. That afternoon, I drove out to the old workshop, unlocked the door for the first time in years, and stood in the cool, dim space. The smell of cutting oil and metal welcomed me home. I ran my fingers over the tools Papa had left exactly where he'd used them last. If you've ever received a gift from someone who truly saw you, especially after feeling invisible for so long, type "scene" in the comments. That moment in the workshop felt like my grandfather reaching across time to tell me I had never been alone. I didn't tell my father about any of it. I didn't need to. For the first time, I understood that my worth had never depended on his approval. It was something I had been building quietly all along. Marcus watched me grow stronger with quiet pride. He still went to the airfield every day, still came home smelling of jet fuel and honest work. but I was starting to notice little things. The way certain people deferred to him. The late-night calls where his voice carried natural authority. I didn't push for answers yet. I was too busy learning how to stand on my own. The real storm was still coming, but by the time it arrived, I was no longer the girl my father thought he could erase. Those early months after the wedding taught me the true meaning of quiet strength. While I was rebuilding my professional life one honest project at a time, Marcus remained my steady anchor. He still woke up before dawn, drove to the airfield, and came home with grease under his fingernails, and that familiar scent of jet fuel that had somehow become comforting. But I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. There were late-night calls on the porch where his voice took on a different tone. Calm, decisive, the kind of authority that comes from someone used to making final decisions. I once overheard him say, "Push the maintenance window to next quarter." "No, I'll handle the board myself." "Don't involve legal yet. A regular aircraft mechanic doesn't talk to a board." Another time, a trade magazine was left open on our kitchen table. The cover story featured a reclusive aviation pioneer known for revolutionizing private aviation on the East Coast. The headline read, "The billionaire who still turns his own wrenches." There was no photo of the man's face, only a gloved hand resting on a turbine blade. Something about that image felt eerily familiar, but I pushed the thought away. Our life was small and real. I didn't want to complicate it. Marcus never lied to me. He simply waited for the right moment. One evening, he found me sitting on the porch with Papa James's brassless level in my hands, turning it slowly under the fading light. "Money is just a tool, Elena," he said softly, almost to himself. "I'd rather you love the man than the toolbox." I laughed and told him he sounded like a fortune cookie. He smiled, but there was something deeper in his eyes, a mixture of hope and patience. I trusted him enough to let the mystery sit. Real love, I was learning, isn't about knowing every detail immediately. It's about knowing the heart behind them. Meanwhile, my own work was quietly expanding. A major general contractor reached out about a critical project, the signature overwater pavilion for my father's new $1.2 billion flagship resort. They needed a structural engineer of record for the cantilevered glass structure jutting out over the ocean. The lead engineer had recommended me based on my recent marina and theater work, not knowing, or perhaps not caring, about my connection to Richard Hargrove. I accepted the job on merit alone. I walked the steel beams myself, found 2 connection details that concerned me, and insisted on corrections before I would stamp the drawings. That pavilion, the most photographed feature of my father's dream project, could not legally open to the public without my professional seal. The irony wasn't lost on me. I told Marcus that night, "I'm not going to the opening as anyone's disowned daughter. I'm going as the engineer who made sure that building won't fall into the sea." He looked at me for a long moment, pride shining quietly in his eyes, and simply nodded. The night before the grand opening, we had our only real disagreement, not loud, just honest. "You should have told me everything sooner," I said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. "I know," he replied. "I needed you to love me as Marcus first, the man, not the chairman. Your father got the same answer. Everyone gets when they treat people like inventory. He just didn't know it was me giving it." I was hurt, but his honesty cooled the anger. We sat in silence for a while. Then he reached over and gently turned Papa James's brass level in my hands. "Tomorrow," I said finally, "we don't humiliate him. We simply stop hiding. Let the truth speak for itself." He agreed. If you've ever carried a secret that grew bigger than you expected, or stood at the edge of a truth you knew would change everything, type ready in the comments. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, listening to the distant sound of jets spooling up across the field, that low rising hum I had come to love. It no longer sounded like background music. It sounded like the countdown to a moment 6 months in the making. I didn't know exactly what would happen the next day, but I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer the girl waiting to be chosen. I had chosen myself. The night of the grand opening arrived wrapped in perfect coastal weather, as if the universe itself was setting the stage. The flagship resort rose dramatically from the dunes, glowing like a jewel against the dark ocean. Strings of lights reflected off the water, and the signature overwater pavilion, the one I had personally certified, shimmered like a lantern suspended above the waves. Marcus and I arrived together. I wore a simple black dress with clean lines, no flash, no apology. Papa James's brass level rested safely in my small clutch. As we stepped into the grand ballroom, I scanned the familiar faces: investors, politicians, reporters, and the same circle that had watched my father erase me at our wedding. My father spotted us almost immediately. He crossed the room with that confident stride, the same smile he used to close deals. For a brief second, I saw something like hope flicker in his eyes. He thought I had come crawling back. "Elena," he said warmly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "I'm glad you came to your senses. And Marcus, good to see you here." He glanced at my husband with the bare minimum of civility. Marcus simply offered a small nod, calm as ever. The program began, lights dimmed. A recorded sound of a turbine spooling up filled the room, that low, rising hum I knew so well. The master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone with visible excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are honored to have a very special guest. For the first time ever, the chairman of North Star Aviation Group has agreed to appear in person." My father turned toward the stage, his face lighting up with anticipation. This was the moment he had chased for 2 years, the final piece that would make his billion-dollar resort truly legendary. The private aviation partnership that would set his flagship apart from every other luxury property on the coast. The massive screens behind the podium glowed to life. North Star Aviation Group, founder and chairman, Marcus Hale. Marcus squeezed my hand once, gave me a quiet, private look filled with love and certainty, then walked steadily up onto the stage. The room erupted in applause. 500 people rose to their feet. Cameras flashed, but in the middle of that wave of admiration, my father stood completely frozen. The color drained from his face. His champagne flute slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Liv lowered her phone, her mouth open in shock. The man my father had publicly humiliated and disowned at our wedding, the worthless grease monkey, was now standing under the spotlight as the reclusive billionaire whose signature he had begged for on his knees for nearly 2 years. Marcus spoke briefly from the stage. His words were professional, gracious, focused on the engineers and mechanics who kept aviation safe. He said nothing about our personal story. The restraint made it even more powerful. When he stepped down, my father moved quickly, desperation visible in every step. He extended his hand. "Marcus, this is incredible. We're family now. We can finalize the partnership tonight, after everything." Marcus looked at the outstretched hand, then at my father's face. His voice carried just far enough for those nearby to hear. "I received your proposal months ago, Mr. Hargrove. I declined it. The reason remains the same. North Star does not partner with men who treat their own daughters like disposable assets to be written off in public." The words landed like a quiet hammer. My father turned to me, fury replacing the shock. His voice rose, cracking the polished atmosphere. "You planned this. You set me up to humiliate me in front of everyone." I reached into my clutch and pulled out Papa James's brass level. I held it up so the light caught the worn brass surface. "Do you remember this, Dad?" I asked, my voice calm and steady. "This is the tool your father used to build the very first motel you later tore down. He taught me that real value is measured, not inherited. You stood at my wedding and declared that Hargroves don't marry mechanics. Yet the first Hargrove who ever mattered was a mechanic with grease on his hands." The room had gone deathly quiet. Reporters were leaning in, phones were recording. I continued, "And by the way, the overwater pavilion everyone is celebrating tonight, the centerpiece of your entire resort, could not legally open without my engineering stamp. I completed the final inspection and signed off on it this afternoon, because the building deserves to be safe, regardless of who owns it." I paused, looking directly at him. "You tried to erase me, but some things can't be erased. The silence that followed my words was heavier than any applause. My father stood there, exposed in front of 500 influential people, his empire's grand moment overshadowed by the consequences of his own choices. There was no dramatic shouting match. No screaming, just the quiet, devastating weight of truth settling over the room. The flagship resort opened 2 months later than planned and millions over budget. The private aviation partnership, the centerpiece promise that had sold out the waiting list, never materialized. Investors began asking questions they had never dared ask before. Board meetings grew tense. For a man who had spent 30 years being the loudest voice in every room, Richard Hargrove suddenly found rooms going quiet when he entered. But this story was never just about his fall. Marcus and I still live in our modest clapboard house near the airfield. I continue to grow my own structural engineering firm. We've added 2 more engineers who share our values of honest work. Marcus still drives out to the hangar most weekends, rolling up his sleeves and turning wrenches because it keeps him grounded. Some things we've learned are worth keeping simple. My father has shown up at our house a few times now. No driver, no entourage, no scripted apologies. He stands on the porch looking smaller than I ever remembered. The first time he asked if he could come in, his voice actually cracked. I let him sit in Papa James's old workshop while I worked. Mostly we stay quiet. Sometimes he watches my hands as I measure and mark. Once in a while he asks what a particular tool does. I tell him. He listens, really listens, in a way he never did when I was just his daughter trying to earn his approval. My mother sends careful, tentative messages now, testing the waters. Liv and I text occasionally, small, ordinary things. We're learning, slowly, how to be sisters without performing for an audience. It's not perfect. Real healing rarely is. There was no grand reconciliation scene with tears and hugs under dramatic lighting. I'm an engineer. I don't trust joints that bond too quickly. We're repairing things one honest conversation at a time, with clear boundaries and no illusions about the past. If you've ever had to rebuild a relationship with someone who once tried to erase you, type progress in the comments. It's messy, but it's real. Looking back now, I realize the greatest gift my father gave me, even if unintentionally, was the freedom to discover who I was without his name. He canceled the cards, but he couldn't cancel the mind, the hands, or the quiet strength I had been building all along. Here is the only lesson I want to leave with you tonight. Inheritance is what someone hands you. Worth is what you build when they refuse to. You can be disowned. You can be underestimated. You can even be publicly erased. But no one, not even the most powerful person in your life, can take away what you create with your own 2 hands and your own steady heart. These days, you'll find me most evenings in Papa James's workshop. His brass level and mine hang side by side above the bench, catching the last light of day. Across the field, I can hear a jet spooling up, that familiar low, rising hum. It used to sound like music, then like a countdown. Now it just sounds like my husband coming home. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. If it reminded you that your worth was never theirs to cancel, go build something this week, no matter how small. Tell me in the comments what you're building. I read every single one. Until next time, measure twice and never shrink to fit someone else's frame.